The French word chateau means castle. A châtelet means little castle. There's plenty of flexibility in these terms. A chateau, like a castle, might be purely defensive and rather primitive. For example, a single Roman tower set on a hill and surrounded by a wooden palisade. Over time, however, these evolved all the way into the luxurious, over-the-top confections we see in the Loire Valley. Let's take a look at the Chateau de Vincennes just outside downtown Paris to see an example that showcases both varieties. Let's visit Vincennes. Hello and welcome back to the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy. I love to travel. I do this on my own, and so can you. I'm here to teach you how. Neighborhoods can change, and what was once on the outskirts of Paris is now practically downtown and serviced by a metro stop. This is a châtelet, or little castle, which surrounds a large, very highly fortified tower. Let's take a look at the site, most of which remains sadly off limits to visitors. This is one of the signboard images inside the chateau, showing the layout of the site. We'll be entering through the so-called village or clock tower gate, which I've marked with a blue arrow. Then visit the Châtelet and donjon, the little castle, with the red arrow, and wrap up at Sainte-Chapelle, the big chapel, which I've marked with a black arrow. Now called the village tower, or sometimes the clock tower, this is the street side entryway to the chateau. The tower, the walls, and the moat remain every bit as impressive as they were the day they were built. This gate housed the very first public clock in France. The gateway, which includes a drawbridge over the moat, a guard tower, doors, and a portcullis, was a defensive necessity as these were troubled times. Much of the time, however, residents and tradespeople still would have needed access to the site, and this was the way they came in. This is one claimant to the title of first public clock in France, although there are others. It was installed in 1461, a whole year before the one in the Palais de la Cité. We don't much see clocks like this anymore. I think that's mostly because everyone has a wristwatch or a cell phone. At the time, however, those didn't exist. This was a costly idea and was the forerunner of municipal clocks that appear in every major European city today. Defending any castle depended on far more than just men and weapons. It had to have multiple lines of defense. Although now mostly long gone on this side of the fort, the surrounding area would have been kept clear of trees and brush so that the defenders could see what was coming at them. Next up there would have been a wall, which I've marked with a red arrow. I suspect the area on either side has filled in some, but this likely was significantly higher than what you see today. Advancing troops would have been forced to climb over it, then drop into the moat. Today the moat is dry and grassy, but once upon a time it was filled with water. This would have been an impressive barrier. Assuming the attackers made it through the fields, over the obstacle wall, and through the moat, the next stop would have been the outer walls. Defenders would have been stationed inside those walls, relatively protected and able to rain down rocks, arrows, and worse on the attackers. This is a detail from the city tower gate. It's a little difficult to see, but just a bit in from the left edge of the photo is the groove through which a portcullis once would have clanged down. I mentioned that the word châtelet means little castle. This map of the châtelet and the donjon is just a word for tower, shows us a mini castle within the larger castle and gives us some idea of the obstacles any attackers would have faced. Once they managed to get past the outer defenses around the village gate and through the grounds, they would have come up against a highly fortified structure surrounded on all four sides by a moat. The only way in was past the exterior guardhouses, not even shown in this image, over a bridge over the moat, shown in the very far lower left corner, then past the gap where the drawbridge would have been raised, through some doors, past more guardhouses, and into the châtelet. The next obstacle would have involved breaching the defended entryways to the tower and making it up the steps. This image shows you the Châtelet and donjon as seen from a vantage point in front of Sainte-Chapelle. The building attached to the left in this photo was the much later constructed King's Pavilion, which is now office space. A well-defended castle could hold out indefinitely, just as long as it didn't run out of men, arms, ammunition, food, and water. This well, just outside the Châtelet, took care of that latter problem. Once an attacker managed to breach the outer walls, get across the gateway, and past the guards, they would arrive at the tower. Getting up that tower would have required a considerable amount of ingenuity, since there wasn't an elevator. There were what's called turnpikes, which are very narrow, rounded stairways leading up. The defenders would have been able to hold off their enemies at each level of these, making them death traps. We need to keep in mind that the king, his family, and at least some of his retainers lived here from time to time. Heating the building in the winter would have required an immense amount of firewood, likely hauled in from the nearby Bois de Vincennes. Possibly there was a block and tackle to raise it to the level of the king's residence. It's marked number 1 in this chart. It is more likely that everything had to be carried up by hand. This was the tallest tower or keep in Europe during the Middle Ages. The donjon maintained its military value up until the beginning of World War II, since the tower gave an excellent view of German forces rolling west in its general direction. French generals directed the defense of France from here until they were overwhelmed by the German blitzkrieg. France surrendered to the Germans on June 14, 1940. This was the tallest tower or keep in Europe during the Middle Ages. The donjon maintained its military value up until the beginning of World War II, since the tower gave an excellent view of German forces rolling west in its general direction. French generals directed the defense of France from here until they were overwhelmed by the German blitzkrieg. France surrendered to the Germans on June 14, 1940. The king most responsible for the Châtelet we see today was probably Charles V. He was a pretty good king from what I've read. He ascended to the throne during the 100 Years' War. He lived here much of the time, in part because it was far more easily defended than anything in downtown Paris. Since he lived here, he had to live his life here. I've read that Charles was particularly devout in his religious observances, which would have included prayer at special times during the day. He apparently had a bell installed here on the same level of his residence, so he would never forget. I heard that replica bell at noontime. It would have wakened the dead. On the right you can see the original bell, which now is displayed in Sainte-Chapelle. This is part of the stone construction of the walls in the donjon inside the Châtelet. Notice the pointed Gothic archway on the left and the hexagonal guard tower on the right. Towers evolved over time. Initially they were typically square. These were easy to build and gave a good amount of interior space. The trouble was that they were extremely vulnerable to being undermined, either by hand or later by explosives. Round towers were developed to counter those problems, but I think they were probably a bit harder to build. The black spots you can see in the openings in the right-hand photograph would have allowed the defenders not only to peer down inside the Châtelet, but to dump various materials on the heads of any attackers. The king's chambers included a bedroom, a small royal chapel called an oratory, a wardrobe, a treasury, and more. These rooms were comfortable and luxurious for their time, with wood paneling, decorative carvings, and side rooms. On the left, you can see the massive but inefficient fireplace. A large, highly decorated cast iron fireback would have reflected heat back into the room, but these didn't come into style until the 16th century. On the right, you can see part of a pillared support for the arches. Traces of paint are still visible. It didn't take very long for authorities to figure out that the same facility which might keep the bad guys out and the crown safe could easily be converted to keep bad people, or at least the people the state considered bad, in. Here we see some graffiti added by prisoners to the former donjon rooms, in this case in the chapel. Charles V was a great music lover, and he would have musicians come and play for him every day. Among them was one Guillaume de Machaut, who was considered a leading French composer of the time, perhaps portrayed in the elaborate carving of the angel with the bagpipe, shown on the left. On the right is a female, likely one of the 9 muses, playing a lyre, probably meant to represent Erato, the muse of romance and romantic poetry. The Sainte-Chapelle de Vincennes is a Gothic royal chapel that vastly expanded the amount of space available for religious activities here in the chateau. The pointed arches and buttresses supporting the walls are hallmarks of Gothic design. The buttresses are lovely to look at to modernize, but they were required by medieval builders to support the huge weight of the walls. Unlike the Sainte-Chapelle de Paris, the building only had 1 floor. On the right is a view of the west front with its large rose window. This would have been the main entry to the facility. Charles V of France was responsible for much of what we've seen today and began building the chapel in 1379. You'll recall he took his religious obligations seriously. That big clanging bell he had installed outside his bedroom was there to remind him when he was supposed to pray. He already had a chapel in his apartment, but he needed something bigger. He purchased what he was told were relics from the crucifixion of Christ from the Emperor of Constantinople, and he needed a place to display them. Charles died before the chapel was completed and was succeeded by his young son, Charles VI, who ruled with advisors and continued the work for a while. Unfortunately, this Charles was also known as Charles the Crazy. He and his advisors didn't manage the realm very prudently, and the situation for La Belle France went downhill from there. Once you're inside Sainte-Chapelle, there's actually very little in the way of decorations, as most were destroyed during the French Revolution. This is a Sainte-Chapelle rose window seen from the inside. These are the Renaissance-era windows in the apse. Construction dragged on for a fairly long time, but King Henry II actually took up the work in 1547 and 1548. He finished the vaults, installed some carved woodwork, and put in place the stained glass windows you see here. The chapel was finally dedicated by Henry himself in 1552. Henry, or someone, obviously decided he deserved full credit for the work, so these windows include a view of him praying in the bottom row of the center window shown here. Here's a better view of Henry praying earnestly and perhaps hoping to be rewarded commensurately by reminding everyone who completed this job. You can get almost anywhere via the Paris Metro, including from the 21st century back to the 14th. Today it takes a little over half an hour to get to the Chateau de Vincennes from Sainte-Chapelle on the Ile de la Cité. Thank you for coming along with me today. Join me next time for another tour here on the Armchair Traveler. Thanks for joining me today. If you found this video interesting or helpful, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's free to you, but it will help the channel grow. Travel sites and history can be word-heavy, especially background information, so some of my video blogs have companion pieces with more for you. There are also pieces which don't make it into video format at all. You can check them out on my WordPress blog site. The address is armchairtraveler2022.wordpress.com. If you'd like to keep up when I post new blogs or video blogs, or are interested in tweet-sized posts, follow me on Twitter. My handle there is @armchair2022. I will tweet updates for new posts, and when I begin traveling again, will take you along in short form on Twitter.